Welcome back. We're talking about the challenges facing Latin America, and let's get back to our panel. It's not all doom and gloom, relatively speaking, in Latin America. You've got countries like Peru, Chile, Colombia, Mexico that have seen growth rates small, but their economies have been growing. What's behind their success?
You know, it's not all doom and gloom at all. There are some very positive things happening on the economic side, also on the political side. I think if you take the political moment first, we're seeing, broadly speaking, a shift away from some of the populist governance that really attracted a lot of people in the region over the last 10 or 15 years, toward a more pragmatic governance style, including economic reform, including trying to manage election country after country. Peru, you mentioned the most recent one. But economically, what we've seen over the last several years is several countries intentionally trying to stay open to the world in terms of a globalization activity, in terms of trying to diversify with some success, not complete success as we've talked about, much more to go, but at least trying to do that. But also, and I think this is a key aspect, also trying to develop increasing links with each other, with North America and with Asia. And 4 countries in particular, I think, you have to look at as being real success stories along these lines. Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, the 4 countries of the Pacific Alliance, which have come together to try to develop a new economic model that's not just based on trade and investment, but also on economic integration. So this is a new model that's emerged in the last few years in Latin America. US-led, it's not Brazil-led, it's not China-led. And this is showing a new path forward that is keeping them open, that is increasing growth rates, and frankly is developing some of those diversified supply chains and diversified investment patterns that we see in more successful economies around the world.
Charles, you mentioned earlier on that Brazil will grow again. It's facing serious problems right now. If we look at some of those problems, unemployment hit 11% in the 3 months ending March. There's a recession, the economy is contracting, and then of course there are the political problems that the president, Dilma Rousseff, is facing. What kind of, in the short term, what kind of economic impact are these problems having on Brazil?
Well, the anti-corruption fight in Brazil, program in Brazil will prepare Brazil for a much better future, because it's the first time in the history of Brazil, the powerful politicians and the most powerful business people are going to jail for corruption, which is very good. It shows the strength of Brazil's democracy, the rule of law, and the Chinese investments in Brazil, of course, are very, very important to stimulate Brazil's growth. So by investing into the much needed infrastructure in South America, in the whole region, it will help the growth, the economic growth of the country and the region, and the transoceanic railway. It will be a very important stimulus for economic growth as well.
Julio, if we look at the politics of the region, there's a Pew Research poll that shows that 77% of Latin Americans believe corrupt political leaders are a very big problem in the region, and it's a very big problem for the economies of that region as well. What do you make of that?
Well, we're talking Latin America here, which is, in the government, it's the politics of extremes, whether it's on the left or the right. When you start hearing, there is this sort of underlying sentiment that politicians are corrupt no matter what their ideology. But one of the interesting things about all this is what it's feared is what I call the Latin American pendulum is swinging back. So what one of the panelists talk about pragmatic governments, when you start hearing words like that, you start hearing about the return of the right, and whether we're starting to see sort of the next shift of the Latin American right, sort of a softer version of it, not the decades of coups and military takeovers, but now we start seeing it through neoliberal policies, through business policies. And so there are concerns amongst sort of Latin America, amongst the populace, because the fact that there's very little middle in Latin America, the history of Latin America has had no middle, if you can argue for that. And so what you've seen is a region that has been exploited by different countries or empires, from the Spaniards to the Americans. So what's happened here is that we're seeing it as the classic pattern of Latin America. So the left, the populists, have been there for 15 years, and guess what? There's charges of corruption, and now we're starting to see the right come back. And the question is, when is that middle going to happen, or are we just seeing different iterations of an ugly past of Latin American politics?
Isaac, what do you think? Is the pendulum swinging back towards the right? Is it the end of, as our reporter pointed out, the pink tide, the end of populist governments?
Now, I am a little bit more confident about the possibilities of the center in Latin America because you see, for instance, the election in Peru, where you have a technocrat, a person that is moderate, defeating a center-right candidate, and promoting a program that is reformist but moderate at the same time, and keeping the economy growing, which is key for the case of Peru. And you see, for instance, the emergence of Macri in Argentina, right, which is also a turn to the center, in my opinion. Consequently, I see hope in those movements. Obviously, the difficulties of those governments that were benefiting from the boom are there, and those have to be resolved. Brazil is processing it in a way that is very impressive, but you see Venezuela, which is very critical, and where you could see an explosion, you know, as a result of this adjustment that has to be done, because the economy was functioning at $100 per barrel of oil, and now has to go down to 50 or 20.
Eric, getting back to Venezuela, what happens in a country like Venezuela? I mean, how does it pay back its debts with the drop in the oil price? Borrowed $50 billion from China. Part of that debt was going to be paid back with oil revenues. Doesn't have that right now. Had to renegotiate the terms of that loan. So what happens there?
That's the question that's on the minds of the people who are holding the bonds right now. Are they going to be repaid, and under what terms? If you listen to the government officials from Venezuela, they say they will meet their debt payments at least through the autumn. And I think they very well may, because on their own political calendar, they're trying to get through until next year, until 2017. And there's a whole issue there in terms of a recall referendum and the timing of that and what that implies in terms of who would succeed the current president if indeed that referendum was held and if indeed the current president lost that referendum. No, absolutely. Venezuela is a one commodity economy, that's oil. It's about 95% of its economy, if not more. And even as oil has ticked up slightly to about $50 a barrel now, that's still well below what Venezuela needs, not just to be healthy, but just to put itself on a sustainable path. So the question one has to ask is exactly what you're asking. What does that imply for the economy long term? And you know, this is something I look at very, very closely. And there aren't a whole lot of positive scenarios for Venezuela. But one of the scenarios I would suggest that has to occur is there has to be some sort of a national consensus on the very deep reforms Dr. Cohen was talking about that have to be implemented in Venezuela to return that country to sustainability. The problem is Venezuela politically is so deeply polarized, so deeply divided now that there's absolutely no way that that consensus will develop absent a political accommodation in some way. And that brings me back to the referendum that currently is being fought about right now. The prospects for Venezuela do not look positive. The country has been so deeply mismanaged for 17 years. It's not just because the price of oil is low. It's because the economic model that's been instituted first by Hugo Chavez and now by Nicolas Maduro has been a disaster. The international community is looking to help, wants to help. To this point, Venezuela, in my view, unfortunately, has kept that help far away and at an arm's distance. So what are the positive solutions there? There aren't many good ones. It is going to require international attention. It will require international assistance. And the irony here, the last point I would make, the irony here is that Venezuela, with the world's largest reserve of proven hydrocarbons, is now an economic basket case.
Right. Julio, Latin American leaders are gathered in Colombia right now for the World Economic Forum. Some of the things that have come out of that conference, gas is going to play an important role in the energy development of the region. There's also $10 billion which has been invested this past year for renewable energy. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is Latin America meeting its challenges in that respect?
Yeah, sure. Of course it is. And again, it's just like I said, it's just like the next phase of how do you exploit the natural resources of a region that's been exploited for centuries. But to get back to Venezuela for a second, you know, it's not as simplistic as the other panelists are saying. And I do think that there's been a history of how the left and the right, the polarizing effect of this, and how, you know, poverty has been uplifted in Venezuela. And yes, Maduro has problems. Maduro has problems right now, But I do fear that in the case of Venezuela, we might be looking at a military coup before we talk about anything else. And that could be conceivably possible in a realistic scenario this year. And, you know, the United States, for example, has stayed very quiet about Venezuela. They kind of are letting it go. You know, they're kind of letting it be like, hopefully the right solution for the United States comes out. So I just want to just take back a little bit of the fact that it's been a disaster for Venezuela. It's a little bit oversimplistic considering how the inequality of wealth has happened in Venezuela for decades before Chavez came on. Not that I'm defending Madurismo, but at the same time, let's just admit that Venezuela is a third-rail issue in Latin America, and it's incredibly polarizing. And the right is just as fault as the left when they tried to take over Chavez in 2002. So let's be real a little bit about this conversation.
Isaac, what do you think? I mean, what kind of change do you think is going to take place in Venezuela? At its worst, do you see a military coup?
Well, look, for the coming out in the side of pragmatism, I hear the news that Secretary of State Kerry has agreed with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela to exchange ambassadors once again. Now, I realize that this is a small drop in the bucket for whatever is happening domestically in Venezuela, but I think that the situation in Venezuela passes through some kind of agreement where the United States is involved, because the United States is the biggest customer of Venezuela. Right. We forget that Venezuela keeps selling oil to the United States normally, despite the political turmoil. Production in Venezuela is now going down as a result of the turmoil. The political turmoil is beginning to affect the productive capacity in oil for that country. That's very bad. But I see a renewal of pragmatism on both sides that perhaps, will lead to some kind of agreement. I'm still hopeful that we are not going to have an explosion in Venezuela, which would be the worst case scenario for everybody. And that democracy in Venezuela will survive.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.